Henry Morgan is mostly known today through the rum mascot Captain Morgan. When I was a kid, I was having a pirate birthday party, surprise, and we drew our own Captain Morgan labels for bottles of raspberry soda. That's my earliest memory of the man, but of course the mascot is far from accurate. Tricorns did not exist during Morgan's time, and his reputation as a pirate is largely unwarranted. Some argue that Morgan was a pirate, others a privateer, but he was really a commissioned naval officer. He only ever attacked the Spanish, which were at war with Jamaica, never attacked anyone without a commission, treated his prisoners fairly, and fought most of his battles on land. He was a tactical genius and deserves to be remembered as other English heroes like the Duke of Wellington. This is the story of the Buccaneer King, Henry Morgan. One of the most important biographers on Morgan's life was Alexander Exquemelin, a surgeon who sailed with Morgan. However, Exquemelin's account should be taken with a pinch of salt due to a possible grudge between the two. We'll discuss more of that later. One of the things he stated was that Morgan was born a peasant and became an indentured servant in the Caribbean. This is false. Morgan came from a Welsh family of warrior aristocrats. One of his ancestors, Thomas Morgan of Pencarn, was known as the Warrior after leading overseas expeditions in the late 1500s. His family had fought on both sides of the Civil War, and one of his uncles, Colonel Edward Morgan, would become Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, a position that Henry himself would hold, in addition to marrying Edward's daughter. But this is for the future. Morgan was just 20 years old when he arrived in the Caribbean. He was an ensign in the invasion force sent by Oliver Cromwell to take over Hispaniola. The invasion ended in a disaster, with almost a third of the army dying from disease. Upon fleeing Hispaniola, the Redcoats managed to capture poorly defended Jamaica instead. However, the local Spaniards and their slaves carried on a stubborn guerrilla war against the invaders. Even after England and Spain signed an armistice, neighboring colonies supplied the guerrillas and arrested any English vessels as pirates. There was no peace in the New World. Whilst Morgan's comrades ascended into debauchery, he lived modestly and eventually saved up enough money to acquire a vessel and crew. He joined ranks with Christopher Minks, a roguish admiral that raided the Spanish settlements. They took Santiago by surprise, a city that had supplied the guerrillas, and blew much of it up with 700 kegs of gunpowder. Only 6 Englishmen were killed in this raid. In Minks' raid on Campeche, he was personally wounded 3 times, but managed to get out rich and victorious. Minks spoke well of Morgan and would later die in a battle at sea. By 1663, Morgan had made some friends and a name for himself. With a force of 200 men and 5 vessels, he sailed out of Jamaica and would not return for 20 months. The Buccaneers landed in the Yucatan Peninsula and went on a long adventure where they marched 300 miles, sailed largely uncharted territories, befriended a tribe of Indians, lived off the land, took several Spanish towns, traveled up a river to Lake Nicaragua, and captured the wealthy and undefended city of Granada by surprise. Who could have expected pirates on a lake? The sheer luck and audacity of the expedition made the Spaniards compare Morgan to Francis Drake, and some say Morgan was even nicknamed El Drac. It was a great start to a glorious career. Morgan returned to Jamaica as a hero. He was now 30 years old. His uncle, the aforementioned Colonel Edward, had died in a Buccaneer expedition of his own, leaving 2 sons and 3 daughters to tend his plantation. Times were hard, since Edward had died poor and the king owed him money. Henry Morgan married one of his uncle's daughters, Elizabeth, and married one of her sisters to a friend. The marriage gave him access to Jamaican high society, and he even purchased his own plantation. He became good friends with Governor Thomas Modiford, who very much wanted the Buccaneers to invest in agriculture. Modiford put Morgan in charge of the militia, and Morgan oversaw the construction of Fort Charles, a mighty stronghold guarding the harbour entrance to Port Royal. However, peace did not last in Port Royal. A Buccaneer attempt to claim a base on the main ended in disaster, and a large number of Englishmen had been captured and were treated worse than slaves by the Spanish. They were forced to work under a scorching sun in knee-high water from 5 in the morning till 7 at night, all the while being beaten and deprived of clothes. England and Spain were currently at peace, but Jamaica was at war. Modiford saw no other choice but promoting Morgan to Admiral and giving him a commission to cruise against the Spanish. Pirates are known for robbing ships at sea, but Morgan fought most of his battles on land. He was really more of a general, and the light vessels under his command were unfit for sea battles. Rather, they were used as transports for getting the Buccaneers from point A to point B. His first target was the town of Puerto Principe, located inland on Cuba. However, a Spanish prisoner overheard his plans, escaped, and told the governor. After this debacle, Morgan and his council would always keep their attacks a secret, until the very last moment. The governor managed to prepare ambushes, but Morgan just navigated around them and defeated the Spanish cavalry by using semicircular formations. He tried ransoming the town, but the neighbors would rather fight him, so the locals paid him in 1,000 beefs instead, that were butchered and barbecued into sea rations. But his men were there for gold, not meat, and after a fight between the English and French Buccaneers broke out, the French left his company, leaving him with only 400 of the once 800-strong army. Morgan told his remaining men that since there were fewer, they would get larger shares. No matter his numbers, Morgan decided to attack Puerto Bello, the third largest city on the Spanish Main, guarded by 3 castles and 60 heavy cannon. They stormed the first castle and the second, but the third gave heavy resistance. The governor himself was defending it, and he would fight to his death. According to one legend, Morgan used the nuns and priests to fix his ladders to the castle, and the governor still fired at them. 20 years later, Morgan filed a libel suit over these claims, and won, putting its authenticity into question. The governor refused any quarter, despite the pleas from his wife and daughter, and the Buccaneers were forced to kill him. Whilst loading his ships with loot, Morgan sent a message and an exquisite musket to the neighboring president of Panama, demanding a ransom for the city, lest he'd come and get the musket back. The president said, "No need," and sent an 800-strong army to reclaim the city. Morgan ambushed and drove them off, and after some bickering negotiations with the president, got his ransom and sailed away a richer man. Much of Morgan's force had perished at Puerto Bello, meaning that his promise of larger shares proved true. The payment was based on rank and severity of wounds. Most of the Buccaneers spent their money quickly, but Morgan was frugal as always. He did, however, spend a lot of time at Modiford's private residence, partying and drinking heavily, and planning their next attack. Their plan was to attack the city of Cartagena, another of Spain's greatest colonies. Morgan was even given a 26-gun frigate, whose firepower would prove essential, had she not blown up during dinner. Morgan survived the explosion by being seated close to the cabin windows and was blown into the safety of the water. With the loss of this asset and much of his crew, Morgan was convinced by a French captain to take Maracaibo instead, which had been taken by the Buccaneer Francois Launay some years prior. Morgan seized the fort near Maracaibo, but when they walked into the town, it had been abandoned. They sailed into Lake Maracaibo and attacked the city of Gibraltar, which had also been abandoned. After stealing some loot and managing to capture one of the governor's ships, they sailed out. By now, 3 Spanish warships sent from Spain to kill Morgan had arrived and blocked the exit to the lake. The Admiral refused negotiations, so Morgan built a fireship out of the governor's ship and sent her at the Spanish. The fireship had been disguised as the Buccaneer flagship, fitted out with a large English flag and extra gun ports armed with drums, painted to look like cannons. Her crew consisted largely of wooden dummies dressed with hats, old muskets and bandoliers. The Spanish did not discover the ruse until too late. Their 40-gun flagship was caught in flames, exploded and sank. The Spaniards wrecked their other warship rather than hand it over to the piratas, and the last one was overwhelmed in boarding combat. The Admiral had taken over the fort guarding the entrance, whose cannons could easily sink Morgan's fleet. Morgan launched a fake attack by land, which forced the Admiral to redirect his cannons from the seaside to the land side, allowing the fleet to escape with a defiant salute. Morgan's attack on Puerto Bello had caused an uproar. The Spanish were infuriated and gave their colonists the order to attack English ships and settlements in the Caribbean. Whilst England had denounced the Puerto Bello raid, its government was split on what to do. The pro-imperialist side saw Morgan and his Buccaneers as their spearhead. The other side wanted lasting peace with Spain. Both sides wanted to keep Jamaica. The imperialists believed that Morgan protected and expanded Jamaica, whereas the pacifists wanted Spain to formally recognize Jamaica as English territory. What about the common people? London was recovering from the Great Fire of '66 that devastated the city, and they suffered numerous defeats against the Dutch. Morgan's victories stood out in these otherwise dark days, and he became a hero. However, Modiford played it cautiously and revoked Morgan's commission. Morgan spent the rest of the year in peace, spending time with his wife and expanding his estate. One place in Jamaica is called Morgan's Valley to this day. Peace did not last. Jamaican ships were continuously taken by the Spanish, and one Spanish privateer issued a personal challenge to Morgan himself. When Spanish ships were sighted off Jamaica's coast, Modiford had enough. He was returning the Admiral's commission. What happened to the Spanish privateer who challenged Morgan? He was hunted down by one of Morgan's friends and killed in boarding action. Morgan assembled the largest force he had ever led, consisting of 30 ships and 1,200 Buccaneers, Jamaican militiamen and Frenchmen from Tortuga. Their goal was Panama, situated right on the wealthy doorstep between the Pacific and the Caribbean. After a scouting force took over a fort as a base, Morgan's army landed and were in for a long march. Morgan's troops never took any provisions with them, so they could move faster. Morgan found it better to live off the land. However, the Panama governor emptied all the stores along their way, so eventually the Buccaneers were forced to eat leather. As for the Spanish, Morgan's men did not face much resistance. The Spanish, upon seeing their numbers, would rather flee than would die for a weak cause. The Buccaneers were there to rob them, not to conquer, enslave, or genocide them. A contingent of Indian archers harassed the Buccaneers, who made their way to the coast of the South Sea, where they found and devoured a large herd of cattle. Shortly thereafter, they spied Panama from a high cliff and threw their hats up in celebration. Few men would sleep that night. After a hearty breakfast, Morgan gave a rousing speech, and the Buccaneers marched. The Spanish had fortified on a hill, their forces consisting of infantry, cavalry, and artillery, and even a herd of cattle which they drove against the Buccaneers. Morgan ordered his sharpshooters to kill the herders, killing the stampede before it reached them. Many retreating Spaniards were trampled instead. His men deployed in square formations to fend off cavalry. The main line of volunteers fought in conventional fashion, whilst the Buccaneers supported them from the flanks with their irregular skirmishing tactics. Morgan imagined himself entering Panama like a conqueror, but the governor wanted to deprive them of plunder and set fire to the city. Morgan became a conqueror of ashes. The Buccaneers were only able to save 2 churches and the suburbs, but were able to excavate a decent load of treasure from the ruins. Morgan suspected that the Spanish had carried the loot away on ships, and sent out Robert Searle to find them. Searle located La Santísima Trinidad, a great ship loaded with the silver and gold from Panama's churches. But Searle's Buccaneers got drunk on stolen wine, and the Trinidad managed to escape. Morgan had ordered them not to drink. 10 years later, another group of Buccaneers would capture the Trinidad and make her into a mighty pirate flagship. But that's for a future video. Since England and Spain had signed a truce, the Buccaneers got the news that their commissions had been nullified. The company split up very suddenly. Some turned to piracy, whilst the French returned to Tortuga. Morgan, however, had family and responsibilities, and likely realized that his privateering days were over. With only 4 ships out of the original 30, he returned to Jamaica. Morgan didn't receive the best welcome. Whilst Panama had been his most profitable raid by far, the loot had to be distributed amongst 1,500 Buccaneers, and many felt they had been cheated. After constant critique and even friends turning on him, Morgan fell ill with fever. Thomas Lynch had been appointed as the governor to replace Modiford, when after a few days of formalities he ordered Morgan and Modiford arrested and sent back to England. Lynch was strictly against buccaneering, and London wanted to appease the Spanish. Morgan's journey across the ocean was hard. The rapidly changing climate and awful conditions in the bottom of the ship made him sick again. The Tower of London would likely have killed him, but the Londoners would not have tolerated it. There was a strong anti-Catholic sentiment going on in England during this year, and Morgan was recognized for his attacks on the Spanish, the face of the Catholic world. He was given free reins to recover his health. He frequented the coffee houses, horse races, and even visited his family in Wales. He befriended a member of parliament, the powerful Duke of Albemarle, who got him into high political circles. Many politicians came and listened to Morgan's TED Talks, where he explained how England could conquer the West Indies with only 10,000 men. Morgan even earned the king's attention. Both England and Jamaica realized they needed Morgan to defend the precious crown colony. Governor Lynch tried suppressing buccaneering, only to realize that Modiford had cleverly used them to defend the island. During one meeting with the king, Morgan had explained his plans for Jamaica's defenses. 20 large cannons and a 5th-rate frigate topped his list. The meeting went so well that the king awarded Morgan with a snuff box, made the king's profile done in small diamonds. During another meeting, Morgan was critiqued for his military expeditions on the Spanish. Morgan argued that his targets had been military installations used for Spanish aggression. When the opposition asked if the Spanish ever told him about the peace treaty, Morgan casually said that they never told him, and even if they had, he would not have believed it, because he thought the Spanish were all liars. The king exploded with laughter. A few days later, Morgan was knighted, made lieutenant governor of Jamaica, and sent back to his home. Lynch was deposed and replaced by Governor Vaughan, with Morgan as his deputy. On his way to Jamaica, Morgan was shipwrecked, but eventually got home and was given control by the Council of Jamaica. Immediately he got down to business. Fortifications were rebuilt, the militia revived, and English colours hoisted from every flagpole. Most of the Jamaican council consisted of Morgan's friends and allies, and he began to grow a bit lax. However, Governor Vaughan did not like Morgan, and often complained to London about him. He claimed that Morgan sullied his position by drinking and gambling in the taverns of Port Royal. Vaughan made continuous attempts to remove Morgan from his position. He wanted to rule as a king on Jamaica, but the council did their best to avert his attempts. What about the Buccaneers, Morgan's old shipmates? Most of them had been given French commissions to continue fighting against the Spanish, but Port Royal was always open for them to sell their goods, and many of the French privateers were owned in Port Royal. Vaughan did his best to stop them, whereas Morgan cooperated with the French, recommending privateers they could hire and such. However, peace did not stay with the French, and war soon loomed on the horizon. Morgan forbade any Jamaican vessels from leaving the Caribbean and ordered the construction of 2 additional forts. 10 slaves were taken from each plantation to aid the construction effort. He even sent out a frigate to recover guns and ammunition from the shipwreck that he had travelled on from London 3 years prior. Thanks to these efforts, Port Royal was able to fend off several small attacks. During this time, Vaughan was replaced as a governor by Lord Carlisle. Carlisle and Morgan became quick friends, so Morgan never interfered with Carlisle's work of synchronizing Jamaican law with English law, much to the protest of the council. It was during this time that the Buccaneers of America was published in Europe. This book portrayed many of Morgan's exploits and was written by Alexander Exquemelin, a surgeon that had sailed with Morgan since at least Puerto Principe. Exquemelin made up a lot of lies about Morgan. Amongst other things, he said that Morgan tortured his prisoners, that he set fire to Panama, that he cheated his men of their loot, and that he raped a woman. All of these points can be disproven by eyewitness accounts, both from Buccaneers and even the Spanish. Regarding torture, Morgan had always treated his prisoners with respect, men, women, and children alike. There might have been abuses committed by his men, sure, but never at Morgan's command. Even then, they were scarce. Did Morgan set fire to Panama? No, as far as we know, the governor did it out of spite. Morgan had threatened to burn towns before, but only if they refused his ransom. Even when they couldn't pay a ransom, see Puerto Principe, he didn't burn it. And why would he burn Panama as soon as he entered? The houses were still full of riches. Did he cheat his men out of their loot? Most of them lived in Jamaica and would have paid him a visit had he tried anything like that. A lot of men had to be paid after Panama, so naturally they received smaller shares. And lastly, the rape incident, where Morgan tried coercing a Spanish woman into having sex with him until she refused and he took away her clothes and food. Morgan's own doctor said that he hadn't heard of any women being mistreated, and that Morgan himself behaved very nobly, especially towards women. The doctor did complain about one of Morgan's captains executing a friar that had surrendered, so I don't think he sugarcoated his account. So why did Exquemelin make up these lies? Either he disliked Morgan, or he wanted a more dramatic story in order to sell more copies. The Buccaneers of America also differs between translations. In the Spanish version, the English are portrayed as brutes and rapists, and the Spanish without any faults. Morgan wasn't happy with all this slander and had the English publishers of Exquemelin's books sued, in particular over the incident of him using religious people as human shields. Morgan won the court case. Was this because the incident was made up, or because Morgan had powerful friends in London? Who knows? But it is amazing that a man we'd call a pirate was able to sue someone over things said about him. Imagine if Blackbeard had been able to do that 50 years later. Before wrapping up with Morgan's death, I'd like to talk a bit about Morgan's personality. He was, after all, a complicated and colorful character that really deserves to be remembered. As we saw from his exploits, he was nothing short of a tactical genius. He was likewise charismatic and clever. When his starved men got sick from gorging on stolen food and wine, he told them the Spanish had poisoned it whilst writing the truth in his report. Whilst being the governor's deputy and an aristocrat, he still sought the counsel of his common soldiers. When he was cornered by the Spanish in Maracaibo, he gathered his men together, read them the Spanish demands, and asked them what to do. The Buccaneers unanimously said that they would rather fight to the death than surrender. He was likewise dedicated to justice. In one incident, a French crewman of his and an English one were having a duel, and the Englishman shot his foe in the back. The French were outraged, and Morgan ordered the Englishman imprisoned and promised that he would be hanged in Port Royal. He made true to his promise. He was likewise dutiful and a patriot, and whilst we remember him as a pirate, he never attacked the Spanish without a commission from Modiford. It didn't matter if England and Spain were at peace, if their colonies intended to harm Jamaican shipping and civilians. His goal was to protect his new home. He took personal slight at being called a corsair or buccaneer, During the Panama attack, some of his men wished to sail into the South Sea and plunder Peru, so he cut the masts of their boats. Their commission ordered them to only attack Panama. Morgan spent much of his life modestly, but during his political career he took to heavy drinking, gambling and smoking. He had lived a long and hard career, and likely wanted to enjoy the fruits of his labor. He was really at the height of his career, having made efforts to protect the merchant shipping, expanded his estate, and even earned a raise. Despite his leniency towards privateers, he clamped down on piracy and ensured that peaceful commerce was the way of the future. During one incident, a group of suspicious men had anchored near Port Royal. Morgan invited them to his mansion, where they ate excellent food and drank deeply, and soon shared stories of their piratical exploits. In the morning, Morgan ordered them arrested. Whilst Lynch had been replaced as governor long ago, his plotting eventually managed to get Morgan removed from his position as lieutenant governor. Morgan fell into heavy drinking. This was the man that had fought most of his life for Jamaica, only to be cast aside. Fortune returned when his old friend, the Duke of Admiral, was appointed as the new governor. However, Morgan was largely ignored by the busy governor, and by 1688 had yet to be reinstated onto the council. By this time, Morgan became ill with dropsy. His doctor described Morgan as lean, sallow with yellowish eyes and a prominent stomach. He vomited in the morning and sat up late in the evening, drinking heavily and browsing 4chan. The doctors said his life was in danger. However, in July of 1688, joyous news arrived that Morgan was reinstated to the council. A ceremony was called where a new assembly is voted in. Morgan and his supporters, all Tories and Royalists, won the majority of the seats. During the ceremony, Morgan was bloated and had to walk with a cane. A rousing speech was given in Morgan's tribute. This was his last public outing, and his final triumph. A month later, Henry Morgan was dead at the age of 53. He was given a proper state funeral, and his will left everything to his wife. Admiral Sir Henry Morgan. He was more than just a pirate. He never attacked without a commission and conducted most of his attacks by land with innovative tactics against superior numbers. He started out with so little, and through luck, charisma and skill, he became one of the most important men in England's imperial history. Without him, perhaps Jamaica had been reconquered by the Spanish and would never have become the most important of England's American possessions. And he was merciful, a patriot, and a family man. He does not deserve to be remembered as a pirate, but as an English hero like Nelson or Wellington. Morgan's life is one of the most documented in pirate history, and I had a hard time condensing it into one video. I wanted to focus on his personality and political career because each of his battles are so rich in detail that they deserve their own videos. They're all unique with their own circumstances, creative solutions and colorful antagonists, so stay tuned for that.
Thanks to Henry Morgan, and for whom we fight!
Let's take a look at a comment from last week. Wilcart taught us a bit about seafaring vessels from the 1500s, like caravel, carrack and galleon. You can pause the video and read his post if it's something of interest to you. Thanks for your insights, Wilcart. Huge thanks to Peter Tisson, my latest supporter on Patreon. You are the bomb, my good sir. And huge thanks to my other supporters, Cole Freer, Max Dweck, Ride Radio 88 and Michael Jantz. And a massive thanks to Lucas Viable for your incredibly generous PayPal donation. If you wish to support me monetarily, please check out the links to PayPal and Patreon in the description below. If you can't, please give the video a like and leave a comment, even just a shitpost. This helps the algorithm spread my content to more people. Cheers!